All right, hello. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be leaving Italy and we're going to look at what's happening in Western Europe. So we're going to look at the Northern Renaissance, and first we're going to look at the political context in which that emerged, and then we're actually going to talk about what the Northern Renaissance was and compare it and contrast it with the Italian Renaissance. All right, so first some general context. So the Renaissance spread to Northern Europe in the late 1400s, and the Northern Renaissance really takes place in what we call the Low Countries, which is sort of Belgium and the Netherlands, that area. It's also going to take place in the German states, France, and England. And there's a couple of reasons why the Renaissance spread. So first things first, there's trade and contact with Italy, and also war, right? Because we know that France invaded Italy after the balance of power broke down in the 1490s. Technology is also going to be really important. The printing press, as we mentioned, made it a lot easier for people to produce books cheaply and easily. So that's going to help new ideas about humanism spread. And then, of course, students from Northern Europe are going to study at those Italian universities that provided a humanist education. So they're going to bring those ideas back with them as well. And then, kind of looking at this broadly, we mentioned all the way back at the beginning of class that after the Black Death, feudalism was on the decline in Western Europe. And we know when we talked about the rise of the Renaissance in Italy that one of the preconditions for the Renaissance was the decline of feudalism in Italy. So that decline of feudalism is going to really take off in the rest of Europe in the late 1400s and early 1500s, which is going to help facilitate the spread of the Renaissance in Northern Europe. All right. On the other hand, though, there's a major difference between the political context of Italy and the political context of Europe that's going to shape how the Northern Renaissance develops. So first of all, as we mentioned, Italy had a very decentralized system of rule. And the power players in Italy during the Renaissance were, first of all, the church, as well as those powerful but non-noble merchant families. So they played a really big role in funding scholarship and artists, which is going to shape what those artists and scholars produced, of course. Now, in Northern Europe, on the other hand, we see a more centralized system of rule. And really the power players in Northern Europe are the monarchs, so the kings. And what we're going to see emerge during this time period is what we call new monarchs, who are very powerful, and we'll talk about what made them new and special. We're going to see the rise of these new monarchs in three places especially. So we're going to see them rise to power in France, England, and Spain. So let's go through each one of those one by one. And as I do this, I want you to kind of look at the similarities and the differences between all of these monarchs. So in France, there's two power players here. There's Charles VII and Louis XI. And what Charles VII is going to, or actually what both of these monarchs are going to do, is they're going to dramatically expand the power of the king at the expense of the nobility. So what Charles is going to do is he's going to create this new kind of tax called the taille. That's how you pronounce that. And what this is going to allow him to do is it's going to allow him to raise money without asking the nobility for permission. So that greatly increases his power, decreases the power of the nobility, centralizes the state, places all that power in the hands of the king. Louis, what he's going to do is he's going to continue to expand the power of the king, and he's going to do this by expanding the territory of France, and he's going to do this through war and conquest. So notice, wars are really expensive, right? But now we've got this new tax to pay for it, so that solves that problem. In England, we're going to see a similar trend towards centralization. We're going to see the king can become powerful in England as well, and the power of the nobility go down. And what's going on in England, a little bit before the time period that we're talking about right now, is England has this civil war called the War of the Roses between these two really powerful noble families, the Lancasters and the Yorks. And this civil war is going to end when King Henry VII starts a new Tudor dynasty. So he puts that to rest, starts a new Tudor dynasty, and what he's going to do in order to centralize the state and increase the power of the king and decrease the power of the nobility is he's going to create what's called the Court of the Star Chamber, which was this court that was outside the normal judicial system. And what he did with this court is he prosecuted nobles who raised their own private armies, which was something that they used to be able to do. So now that nobles can no longer raise their own private armies, that's going to give a lot of power to the king. And in contrast to France, Henry VII, rather than focusing on war, is going to focus on trade and diplomacy. And the reason why that is because in England, If a king wants to go to war and he needs money, he has to go to parliament. And parliament is dominated by the nobles. Parliament's like their legislature, it's kind of like their Congress, but it's dominated by the nobles. So Henry VII, by raising money through trade and negotiating with other countries, is going to make England really wealthy and powerful, but it's going to solve the problem of him having to go to the nobility. It's going to, again, increase his power, decrease the power of the nobility. In Spain, we're also going to see a trend towards centralization and stabilization. So the names we have to remember here are King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And if that rings a bell and you associate those names with Columbus, yep, same people. So you may also remember from middle school that prior to the rule of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Spain was partially under Muslim control, and actually had been entirely under Muslim control even before that. So that rule was on the decline, and Ferdinand and Isabella are going to, first of all, embrace the power of the Catholic Church, and they're going to unify Spain and push out any remaining Muslim rulers. In addition to persecuting Muslims, though, they're also going to wildly persecute Jewish people. So where we see France and England kind of making this enemy out of the nobility, Spain's going to make an enemy out of religious minorities. But similar to France and England, they're going to centralize the power of the state and increase the power of the monarchs. All right. So let's talk about a counterexample to these new monarchies. So one of the other power players in Europe is the Holy Roman Empire. And you're like, Roman Empire? So they must be in Italy? The Holy Roman Empire, is actually in Central Europe. And they call themselves that because they're trying to sort of legitimize themselves by associating themselves with the Roman Empire. And they aren't a new monarchy. And that's because they don't centralize the state. They don't increase the power of the king. They don't put an end to any civil wars. They don't kick out any other people. And instead, what they do is they become powerful, not by expanding the power of the king, but by expanding their power and territory. So the Holy Roman Empire is in Central Europe. It includes the German states, and they are led by the Habsburg monarchy. And what the Habsburgs do is they get very, very, very good at marrying off all their little Habsburg children to other monarchies, which helps them build alliances and expand their power and territory. All right. So now that we've talked about the political context of the Renaissance, Northern Renaissance, let's actually talk about what the Northern Renaissance was. And just like in Italy, we see humanism playing a really important role in the Northern Renaissance. But it's a little bit different than Italian humanism. So like the Italian humanists, the Northern Renaissance humanists believed in the importance of studying the Greeks and the Latin classics, right? Similarly, they also emphasized education, and they also believe that knowledge can and should be used to change society. So they're very similar to the civic humanists that we saw emerge in Italy. Now, what's different about these guys, though, is that they were much more religious, and they really focused their energies on reforming the church. So they believed the church was really corrupt and thought that it needed to be changed. And again, if this is starting to ring a bell for you, you're like, wait, Church, Reformation, Northern Europe. Yeah, these folks are laying the foundation for the Protestant Reformation that we're going to talk about next unit. And the key figures you have to know here were both major critics, again, of that corruption in the church, and believe that knowledge could and should be used to reform the church. So these guys are Erasmus, who was from the Netherlands and is in the picture there, and then also Thomas More, who was from England, and he wrote a book called Utopia, and that's actually the first time that word was used to mean what it means. All right. So the key features of the Northern Renaissance, let's talk about those. So first of all, there's an emphasis on realism and attention to detail, just like in the Italian Renaissance. But the way they approach realism is a little bit different. So in the Italian Renaissance, they depicted sort of realistic figures that were based on, human models, but they tended to be really idealized. In the Northern Renaissance, they depicted people kind of warts and all. Now, another difference between the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance is they both focused on portraiture. They both like that. But the Northern Renaissance artists also really like to do landscapes, and they also really like to do interiors of homes. So showed what people's home lives look like. And also sort of continuing from that, another really big difference between the Northern Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance is that Northern Renaissance artists really like to depict middle class and peasant life versus just the lives of the wealthy. And that partially has to do with who was funding these artists, because remember in the Italian Renaissance, you had folks like the Medicis and other wealthy families funding these artists. So of course they wanted to have pictures of themselves painted. So Italian Renaissance artists really spent a lot of time painting pictures of their wealthy patrons. And then finally, another key difference between the Northern Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance is just like how we talked about the Northern Renaissance was kind of more religious generally. That's also reflected in their art, and we'll see an example of that in just a second. All right. So let's look at some examples. So this is the first one. This is a painting by Van Eyck, and it's called Giovanni Arnolfini and His Wife. And the biggest feature of the Northern Renaissance that we see in this picture is that attention to detail. So if you take a look at the larger picture on the right-hand side, you can see there's a tiny mirror in the background. And if you zoom in on it, that's what's on the left, you can see the couple is actually reflected in that mirror. So look how small that is. And look at the beads hanging on the wall and the brush, right? So there's this real attention to, first of all, the interior of this family's home and what it looks like, right? So this incredible tiny, tiny detail. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about one other feature of Northern Renaissance art that you see in this picture. And I'm going to give you a little bit of context that might help you do this. Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife are just two random people that the artist knew. They're not wealthy, they're not merchants, they're just two random people. All right. So next up, this is actually a woodcut by Albrecht Dürer, who is a German artist. And that's another thing you see with the Northern Renaissance. It's not just paintings. We also see woodcuts here. So this is a painting, or not, excuse me, I just messed up. Messed up my own, what I just said. This is a woodcut. This is a woodcut of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And what I'd like you to do now, there's a bunch of ways you could take this. Tell me another feature of Northern Renaissance art that you see reflected in this artwork.